ActionSA wants the polling industry to be regulated to avoid a possible disinformation during the election period. The party has accused some companies of enabling political disinformation. Joining us is Michael Beaumont, ActionSA National Chairperson. Michael, great to see you again this afternoon. You obviously have a bone to chew. Is there evidence that suggests the claim that the recent polls published by local media houses were false or biased?
Without any question, Hugo, and thank you. I think when you look at what took place last Sunday, the 10th of March, 3 media outlets, which I won't name because this isn't about fighting with people in the media, published an article, and that article was presenting polling. The polling was said to be confidential, and the source of it was not shared. But yet the journalist, who obviously had it syndicated in all 3 platforms, spent a great deal of time talking about the historical credibility of the organization that did that polling. We have subsequently come to believe that that polling was actually produced by the Democratic Alliance, which, comes as no surprise, therefore, that they emerge as the greatest victors in that particular outcome. If I'm not mistaken, placing their support somewhere in the region of 27%, a whole 7% higher than the last election. And I think the reality, Hugo, is we've got to ask ourselves a question, is our democracy safe from political misinformation? Because our democracy has come a long way since 1994. The world of social media and the world of polling have come together that information can be spread very quickly. And it's a risk because ultimately South African people do place credibility on what polls say. Political momentum is a reality. And for many voters, they look at a political party that is believed to be growing and saying its influence is increasing and therefore I will support it. Or if a political party is declining, its influence is coming down and therefore I won't. But there's a variety of other polls that are out in South Africa at the moment around which we have to ask some very real questions. The same article cross-referenced the Social Research Foundation, which we know outsources its polling to a company called Victory Research. Victory Research is run by 2 individuals, Gareth van Onselen, a former DA staffer and head of the DA communications at the time, and Johan van den Berg, which, according to his own LinkedIn profile, appears to be the current head of research working for the Democratic Alliance. Once again, it should come as no surprise that that poll was placing the DA as high as 30%, but also going as far as creating a narrative that while this party is growing, all these other parties are getting smaller. There's a very real concern that the information being provided to South Africans may well be being manipulated for political outcomes.
So, do you have evidence on what you suggest is that this is DA behind this poll, and obviously Victory Research, which you say are aligned to DA? We will obviously reach out to both the DA and Victory Research to allow them a right to respond.
Well, I think the first thing must be said is that we need to get to the source of what that poll was that was published in the media in the media last Sunday, the 10th of March, because our information says it comes from the Democratic Alliance, and there's no reason why a journalist would go out there and say, it's confidential, we can't say the source, but it's a very credible company. That needs to be tested, and that's why we've laid a complaint with the press ombudsman, because we think they need to get to the bottom of that particular information.
So you think journalists should be held accountable for publishing poll results without disclosing their origins?
Without any question. And if you look at what the Electoral Code of Conduct says in our country, which came into effect the day there was an election proclamation, it says that any person is in breach of the Code of Conduct if they provide information that is false to the South African people. False in this particular instance has to include withholding important context that allows people to see what the origin of that poll was. But certainly the press code is very clear, is that media institutions have to provide South Africans with that kind of context, and they can't withhold it when that information is vital to the understanding of the story at hand.
So just what are the implications of these polls, do you think, on the votership? Do you get the impression that an individual will look at a poll and say to themselves, you know what, this poll suggests that Party X is going to win this election, so I'm now going to vote for Party X? I
think the implications are profound. I think on one level what you're saying is absolutely true. Momentum is a real thing in South African politics. Some voters will look at it to say, if this party is growing, then I want to be part of its increasing influence that will arise after an election. If this party is not growing, I wouldn't want to waste my vote on that party. I think at one level, that is without any question, the reality. But it goes beyond that, Hugo, because what these polls then do is create narratives about other political parties. And you will see a lot that has been coming out to say that the surge in support behind parties like MK and the EFF, also comes out as a political narrative. Because very soon thereafter, political parties come out and say, we have this, rising force in the left of South African politics. We need to counter it. Vote for us. We can keep them at bay. They are enemy number one. And these narratives ultimately have a very real impact on the elections. And I think as a country, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we sufficiently immunized against that kind of misinformation and the impact it can have on our democracy? And I think the reality is no. If you look around the world, in France, there are regulations that actually limit the publication of polls once an election has been proclaimed. In Canada, polling companies have to register with their electoral agency there so that the methodology and the sponsorship behind a poll becomes part of what is published. Brazil does exactly the same thing through their superior electoral court. The reality is in South Africa right now, we're entirely unregulated in this particular area and is vulnerable to the kind of abuse that we think is taking place.
So, you will admit that various publications have different editorial policies. Now, some editorial policies or some media houses might be slightly inclined or even biased towards a particular party. So, how is this any different to the headline in a particular publication saying ANC are likely to fall below 50%, or ActionSA to receive only 5% of the vote in a particular area? Do you then take them to task?
No, I don't think so. I think it's
so how is this any different?
Well,
then?
I think it's fundamentally different in the following way, Hugo, is that the measure of the fairness of that reporting and the legitimacy of that reporting must be about the information provided. If a headline says that, presumably the article is then going to outline what basis the journalist has to make that particular claim. And journalists and readers will have the opportunity to consume that information and make their own assessment about how credible that particular headline is. The difference here is that the information behind where this poll comes is being deliberately withheld from the South African people. And ask yourself the question, why would anyone withhold the origin of a poll from the South African people while speaking up its credibility? It is sinister.
So finally, you and I have had a number of conversations over the last few weeks, and in many of those conversations you're taking various political parties or various arms around politics and the situation we find ourselves in, which is the May 29 election, if you will, to task. So how does ActionSA justify its role as the police, so to speak, of these political issues?
Well, I think firstly, we don't believe ourselves to be the police. We believe ourselves to be an actor in the environment of politics in South Africa. We are out here saying that we think there needs to be regulation. We are going to be a party that's going to be in Parliament after these elections. We're going to have a considerable influence in Parliament. And we need to be able to have conversations with the South African people as to whether our electoral democracy is sufficiently protected from the kinds of abuse that we're talking about. We're putting forward the view that we do not think it is protected. We think there are currently forms of abuse taking place that are providing political misinformation into the minds and views of voters. And we're raising that with the South African people because there needs to be a conversation. We don't believe ourselves to be the police, but we do believe that the Electoral Code of Conduct very specifically rules out political misinformation, and therefore we will take our complaint there. And as does the Press Code, where the Press Ombudsman will have to review whether the conduct of the journalist in question was acceptable. From our point of view, there's no way it could be.
Michael Beaumont, ActionSA National Chairman, always good to speak to you. Thanks for coming onto the show.
And you.